The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents debate thoughts and tips from Matt Dillahunty. So in the process of going through these various arguments for the existence of God and talking about the nature of debates, it occurred to me that I get lots of email with lots of questions, and it might be a good idea to answer some of those questions and address some of those topics. People are asking, how do you do what you do? How do you maintain your patience? And which, I don't always do. We're going to get frustrated. There's going to be times where you slip up. How do I get better at this? And that's the whole purpose of this. So I thought what I'd do is I printed out some common topics where I have some suggestions. These are my thoughts. I'm not the ultimate arbiter or dictator of what one should or shouldn't do, but this is how I feel about certain things. And since there are people who appreciate what I have to say, I'm going to say it. One of the first things I'd say is when it comes to debates, whether you're talking about formal debates or informal debates, by informal debates, we're just talking about conversations with people, family, friends, whatever. If you're going to engage on these topics, the best recommendation I can make, I think, to start with, is to be yourself. It's nice to watch other people debate, to learn things from them. There are plenty of people out there with great thoughts to learn from and little nuggets that you can pick out about different arguments and things that resonate with you. They may resonate with other people. And there are other arguments and style things that you can pick up from people. But we don't need a bunch of Hitchens clones or a bunch of Dillahunty clones or a bunch of Dan Barker clones. What we need are people out there who are representing themselves and their own thoughts and doing it honestly. One of the common accusations that I've heard from some theists is that atheists are just sitting out there regurgitating stock arguments from sites, which is ironic because I find that the opposite is actually true. I find that many times when I'm engaging with a theist, they are presenting something they saw at carm.org or some apologetic site, and that they truly haven't spent much time thinking about it or studying it. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen with atheists too. I'm sure it does. And I've perhaps done it in the past as well. Dug in too much on a topic that I wasn't familiar enough with because, I'd heard this before and I'll just run with it. And it encourages people to make these accusations that, you're not actually thinking, you're just parroting somebody else's ideas. And that's why I wanted to put together this video series to give people a little more depth in different areas, not so that they would copy what I was saying or the way that I was saying it, but so they could take this information, roll it into their own bank of knowledge, and then be themselves. When it's clear that you are speaking about something that you understand, that you're passionate about, and you're representing yourself, that's going to resonate better with an audience, whether it's an audience of 2 or an audience of 2,000. The next point is to have a good reason to be engaging in these debates. Why are you doing this? Are you doing it to make yourself look better? Are you doing it to make them look foolish? Do you have this mindset of that you need to beat your opponent or humiliate them? Don't get me wrong, there are some apologists that are rather smug, and I have no objection to allowing them and helping them to make themselves look foolish on occasion. There's a debate that JT and I did where our opponents, one of them is an incredibly nice guy who I like and who I'll reference in a moment. The other one was incredibly condescending and seemed to be, frustrated before we began and desperate to show, that he had an understanding of things that we simply didn't. And there was a moment in the debate where my ego took over, and there's no way I was going to let him leave thinking that he was necessarily smarter than me. So we had kind of like a philosophical penis measuring contest in the middle of this debate where we're going back and forth, and I'm showing him that yes, in fact, I understand the topic and I understand the language you use. And I've thought about this, and here's the fallacy in your thing. And it was great for that moment. And then JT did something that was awesome, which was to say, hey, wait a minute, I was a music major. Let's bring this back into the realm of things that people can understand. it's okay. There's automatically going to be an adversarial aspect to some debates. But if your motivation is just to look clever, to make them look stupid, I think that's inferior. My ultimate motivations when doing this involve convincing people, educating people, getting good information out there. I want the audience to know that they've met someone who's an atheist, so that they can never again say, oh, I've never met an atheist, or I've never met an atheist who understood these topics, or I've never met an atheist who really was involved in Christianity and understood and believed at this level. I want them to walk away challenged, because that gives them something to think about. People will often say that, why do you do this? This is a waste of time. Why would you debate Psy? Or why would you even bother responding to somebody like, G-Man or some random YouTuber? One of the things is that I'm not responding to the individuals. I'm responding to their arguments. And some of their arguments are outlandish, and it's worthwhile to point out that these arguments are outlandish. And some of the arguments are rather common. They're things that you're going to run into whether you're talking to, your Aunt Josephine or William Lane Craig, because perhaps your Aunt Josephine got the argument from William Lane Craig. So familiarizing yourself with these topics, having as a goal the motivation of clearing up confusion, pointing out fallacies, educating people, and trying to make a better world. If you are a person who thinks that this is a waste of time, you're never going to convince anybody, then you have no business engaging in these conversations, either one-on-one or in front of a big crowd, because you're simply wrong. I mean, I've got mountains of evidence, letters from people who are saying, oh, thank you guys so much, because of what you did on the Atheist Experience or what you did in this debate. I have since changed my mind. I'm a better person for it, etc. When you're engaging, try to remember to attack and address the issues and not the person. People deserve compassion and respect until such time as you find out that they don't want it, that they're engaged in things dishonestly, and that they are no longer deserving of respect because they're a terrible character. But even when you recognize that, you might run the risk of alienating your audience by exposing it. It's far better to make sure that you're constantly addressing the arguments and the points, and try to stay away from getting into the mudslinging, name-calling. It's going to happen on occasion with most people. I do it. I'm guilty of it. These tips that I'm talking about, these ideas, these are lessons that I've learned and that I'm continuing to learn. There are mistakes that are going to be made by me and anybody else who engages on this, because these are topics that go to the core of people's identity. And it's difficult for them to not take offense and recognize that not only are people probably going to be offended by what you say, they're probably already offended by the fact that you exist and you won't shut up about it to begin with. If you're in front of an audience, you need to actually not be reading to the audience and just talking at them. You need to try to focus as if you're talking with them. Get a feel for them. Take a look around. Look at the reactions that you're getting. Because one key aspect is to know when you've lost your audience. And that applies in two areas. One, where you've said something that perhaps people don't understand. You didn't phrase it correctly. It wasn't something that a lot of people grasped. So you may see confused looks. But the other aspect of losing the audience is when you've said something that might shock and appall them to the point where now they're going to tune out. I did a debate in Ohio, I think it was, where my opponent asked the audience to imagine the worst trauma or worst thing that had ever happened to them and relive it, basically triggering the entire audience. And he had lost them. And I had to dial it back a little bit in addressing what he said, because I had to recognize that he had already lost the audience. And if I continued to push along that path, we could both lose the audience. Instead, let them make the mistake. One of the key things is to listen to what they actually say. Take notes when you can. I mean, I realize you're not always in a position where you can take notes. But listen, and don't just wait for your turn to speak. You might hear your opponent mention the origins of the universe, and this will set your brain working. Oh my gosh, we're talking about some version of the cosmological argument. Let me start preparing my response now. But the mere mention of the origin of the universe doesn't mean that they're presenting anything like the cosmological argument, and you might miss something. And then all of a sudden, when it's your turn to reply, you're no longer addressing what they actually said. There's an episode of the Atheist Experience where Russell and I were sitting there, and a caller called in to ask us what we thought about the ontological argument. And for whatever reason, both of us, I don't know whether we thought we heard cosmological argument. I think that we just confused the two without any good reason. And we gave, a fairly decent response to some version of a cosmological argument, which had absolutely nothing to do with what the caller asked. And we ended up looking incredibly foolish. We didn't address what they said, and it looked like we didn't have any understanding of these topics, even though we'd both spoken about the ontological argument before. So this process of active listening is one that I strongly encourage, is very important when you're going to have these conversations, especially if you're going to be engaging by using strong tools like the Socratic method. If you don't actually pay attention to what they say, the questions that you ask may not be guiding them towards a realization that what they said was wrong. Instead, they'll just say, well, this person clearly didn't listen, they didn't understand what I was saying, and they don't get this. And that brings me to the next point, which is to actually address what they say and not what they've said in the past. And when I say address what they say, I'm talking about what they say during that conversation. Don't bring up past statements from this individual unless they're relevant to current statements. Prime example of this mistake is in the debate with Cy. And Cy's the one that actually made this debate, or made this mistake. His entire opening was kind of clips of my greatest hits from the show and him responding to them. When you do that, you're debating a straw man. You're not engaged with the person on that day with what they've said, because my views may have changed from the time that he showed those, that those clips were made. And it may be that he's trying to prop up different simple arguments to knock down instead of addressing what I'm actually saying. If you're engaged with someone who has a history of saying certain things that are relevant to the topic, it's fine to bring those up, to ask for clarification. When you said this, did you mean it? Do you still hold to that position? How does what you've said in the past on this subject relate to what you're saying right now? But during the course of the debate or discussion, you need to address what they've actually said at that time in that place. Or it's going to look like you are more interested in attacking the individual and their character and what they've said in the past than their actual issues. Be ready and willing to say, I don't know. Be willing to acknowledge a good point when it's made. It may not happen very often, but it does happen. One of the debates that I mentioned earlier, with the JT and I were doing, one of my opponents' name is John Ferrer. And we've since done a second debate, myself and John, on a podcast or something. And during that debate, John challenged me on a point that I'd made, that I thought that I had come up with a fairly clever solution to the is-ought problem, the idea that you cannot derive an ought from an is. And he pointed out that my solution actually smuggled in another ought, that there was a hidden premise in there. And you can listen to the debate, and while I didn't, fully concede, yes, absolutely, that's correct, he made the point, and I immediately acknowledged that I think that I probably said I would have to think about it some more, and I have. But I acknowledge that he may in fact be right, that might be what I'm doing. And it's not an admission of defeat. It didn't lose a debate. If it did anything, it demonstrated that I am actually willing to think about things, reconsider my positions, that it's possible over the course of a debate for me to acknowledge that I've been wrong about something. And this one particular issue did not affect the broader positions. The fact that I was, I made an erroneous argument about a peripheral issue didn't change the fact that my objections to theistic apologetics were sound as far as I can tell. And that brings me to another issue, which is don't overreach. There's a burden of proof involved. And when people are claiming that they have sufficient evidence to justify, to warrant believing that a God exists, they're making a claim that carries a burden of proof. It's possible to set about a course of debunking. Oh, you claim you can read minds? Well, I can prove that you cannot read minds. And depending on how they define things, you may be able to actually show that what they're saying is in fact false. You may be able to prove the contrary. But that's not always the case. And not only should we be teaching people about the default position, about the burden of proof, about when something is rationally justified and when it's not, but we should avoid adopting a burden of proof unnecessarily. So when people say, Jesus never existed, he was an invented fiction. If that's a case that you think you can make, by all means, feel free to make it. But it's nice to recognize that this is unnecessary to begin with. And it's good to point out that even if you fail to demonstrate that Jesus never existed, that we're still in the position of not having sufficient evidence to necessarily believe that he existed, or that everything that has been said about him is accurate, or that he performed miracles, etc. So don't adopt a burden of proof unnecessarily, because it can play against you. It can look as though, oh, he's saying that Jesus doesn't exist. He didn't really make his case. Therefore, Jesus did exist. You can encourage a fallacious conclusion by mistakenly adopting a burden of proof. Put the burden of proof where it's supposed to be. Build up the arguments to show why their positions shouldn't be accepted. And then you can extend into, not only do we not have good reason to believe that you are correct, we may in fact have good reason to believe that you're wrong. And that's where you can extend a little further. One of the common examples that we've used before is, even if evolution turns out to be incorrect and disproved tomorrow, that doesn't mean that creationism is true. But you don't have to adopt the position that creationism is false and set out to try to prove that it's false. You can just point out that creationism hasn't met its burden of proof. It doesn't make any sense, that there's no good reason to believe it. And by the way, we have an alternative explanation, which is robust, peer-reviewed, it is the cornerstone of science, etc., without going a bridge too far. Be ready to make that positive case only after it's clear that your failure to prove that positive case doesn't make your opponent win by default. There are some apologist debaters who will begin their commentary by saying, oh, well, what my opponent needs to do is prove A, B, and C. Lane Craig does this quite frequently. And the correct response to that is to point out that, no, in fact, I don't have to do A, B, and C. You're the one who's asserting a positive case. You have a burden of proof to meet, and your argument doesn't just stand merely because I've been unable to refute it, or someone else has been unable to refute it, or merely because we haven't been able to entirely debunk it. You have to have positive evidence for your position. Try to have some relatively short responses for common arguments. And somebody out there is probably face-palming right now because I am probably least effective at coming up with short answers, succinct answers. And this is partly because I am very concerned about clarity. Every time I've seen conversations where we try to give shorter, concise responses, they have not done much to aid clarity. I am perhaps neurotic about having said something that I thought was just awesome and clear and obvious to everybody, only to find out that it wasn't obvious to everybody. Everybody doesn't have the same understanding of things that you have, and you need to recognize this. They don't have the same level of understandings. They may not have had access to the same information. They're not going to think the way you think by default. So the short answer, while great, isn't always going to be the most effective. But you should try to have some of them, so that in the responses you begin with those short responses, those concise objections to their position, and then you build on those with an explanation. It's kind of a 1-2 punch of responding, and I'm not talking about just giving some kind of glib, funny answer, although that can occasionally work and it resonates with people, but it's, this old argument and here's why it's wrong, boom, and then expand beyond that. Another thing I'd suggest is to practice. Practice a lot. I'm not claiming to be the world's best debater or anything else, but there are people who are convinced that I'm pretty good at it. I think I'm pretty good at it. I don't think I'm anywhere near the best, but it's because I've done a TV show for the past 10 years. I spend a lot of my free time studying this stuff. I engage in conversations in email. I used to spend more time on internet forums, occasionally YouTube type debates and discussions, hangouts. Get involved and actually have the conversations. You have to be willing to look foolish, to make mistakes, to learn from them. I think if you go back to the early episodes of the show, I was hopefully worse then at doing this than I am now. You can argue with yourself. Don't get too entrenched in this, because you may, you can't think of the things that you didn't think of. And so arguing with yourself is not necessarily the most effective. But I find that saying things out loud, hearing the arguments, changes them. Just writing it down and saying, oh, this is the argument, I've read this particular article, I've read this book, I've studied what they actually say, the words that they say, the syllogism that they've put together, and here's a response to it. Doesn't feel the same as speaking. And if you don't have the opportunity to speak on a TV show or speak in public debates, a good way to practice is to speak out loud and have the discussions with yourself, to hear how what you're going to say is going to sound to other people. Now, I live primarily in the world of ad lib and extemporaneous. I do a live TV show. I've got, a handful of lines of notes here, but I'm mostly just talking. And the ability to do that comes from doing it over and over again. And not everything that I say, even if it sounds like, oh, he just off the cuff came up with that, is something that I actually came up with off the cuff. It may be something that I said during a conversation with myself or with someone else, and I just file it away and pull it back out when it seems appropriate. Practice is the only way that you're going to get better. One thing to keep in mind, and I really struggle to make sure that this is foremost in my mind, there is no official representative of atheism. There is no official spokesperson for atheism. We have no holy book, no governing organizations, no popes, and nobody who's making pronouncements on behalf of atheism that this is the law. However, when you're in these discussions, even though there isn't and should not be an official representative of atheism or skepticism or whatever whatever idea you're representing, in that moment, to the person you're talking to and to the audience, there's a very strong chance that they are going to view you as representative of atheism, skepticism, etc. And you need to have that in your mind, because while it's perhaps unfair for you to carry the burden of shouldering the responsibility of being that representative, in that moment, you are being viewed as that representative. And so what you do and how you do it is going to reflect on others. I was president of the atheist community of Austin for over 7 years. And while I had no interest in running around doing all kinds of crazy illegal things, it was always in my mind, wow, I need to be extra diligent at making sure that I'm the best representative I can be, and that I don't do anything that would diminish or harm the movement that I'm trying to serve. This is something that I'm passionate about. This is something that I care about. I want to change the world. The last thing I need, there are atheists, and I've been guilty of this as well, who will just mock, oh, Ted Haggard, yeah, he's completely heterosexual, or Jerry Falwell died, oh, we're glad to be rid of him, and stuff like that. We are mocking these figures who were representative of their movement for hypocrisy, for not living up to the standards that they were advocating and that they challenged in other people. And that's, I think, deserved. Pointing out, that religion doesn't make people better and that there's a problem of hypocrisy within religious groups is a good thing. But you also need to remember that you can do a lot of damage to the atheist movement if it turns out that you're just a terrible representative, even though you're not supposed to be a representative. When you're engaged in these topics, it's unlikely that you're going to come across anything new, but you might. So be ready for it. This goes back to the listening. There are people who may have misheard or misunderstood an argument to the point that they present something entirely new, and it's most likely going to be garbage. It's most likely going to be almost word salad confusion if they've made that kind of mistake. But you need to be able to address what they've actually said, and you need to be listening to, did they spew out any numbers? Did they spew out any facts? If they speak in generalities, the Bible is the most well-documented book ever. Well, okay, what do you mean by that? How do you address that? But if they start talking about numbers and manuscripts and percents and probabilities, you need to challenge how they reach those conclusions, what the evidence is, because sometimes people just make stuff up or they misremember what they've heard. Beware of the thing called the Gish Gallop in these conversations, where someone will present a long string of claims, short claims, boom, 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 and it's impossible for you to rebut them all. So what do? How do you deal with that? Well, one of the things is to stick to your strengths and stick to their weaknesses. If they've made 20 points and you're not going to have time to address all of them, try to find the weakest of their position, point it out, the weakest argument for their position, point it out, and then pick the area where you are strongest, where you personally have the best understanding, the thing that stood out to you as, hey, I've already addressed this, or I have a really good response to this, and do that. And also acknowledge and point out that what they've done is present more information than could possibly be addressed, and that we can't turn this into a 10-hour debate, but the fallacies are consistent throughout the arguments. And if you make a mistake, acknowledge it, clean it up, and move on. The audience, whether it's one person or 1,000, they're going to appreciate the fact that, oh wow, this person isn't just mindlessly throwing out information. They are not just stubbornly standing there refusing to acknowledge the points the other person made. They're actually thinking, and they're willing to acknowledge that they're wrong, and they're willing to correct it. One thing to remember is that you don't owe anyone an explanation or an argument. I know we're talking about giving people tools to be better at debating and having the conversations, and that's great. But outside of a formal structured debate, if you're engaged with someone, it's fine to say, let's pause. Let's put this on hold for a minute. Let me go back and think about what you said and get back to you. Or that's not an area that I'm comfortable talking about. I have no expertise in that area. And while you may find it convincing and I may not have a ready response to it, I'd rather talk about these other things where I do have an interest and I do have some expertise. And it's also fine to just stop the conversation and say, I don't feel like continuing. This isn't necessarily a concession that you're right. You're free to take it that way if you'd like. But I'm no longer comfortable having this conversation. And that can happen both when you aren't familiar with arguments and you need to go back and do some research, but it's also the case when it just makes you uncomfortable, when you don't see that this conversation is likely to be productive at all. And lastly, in the informal discussions, the most common ones that we're likely to have, the ones that we have with friends and family members, people over dinners, these conversations that aren't the adversarial, structured, formal debate with an audience. Think about the points that I've made, particularly why you're doing this and why you're having the conversation. But if you think that the people you're talking to are stupid, or you don't care about them, Why would you spend time having the conversation and trying to convince them? I have conversations with people because I respect them. If I don't respect them, then I'll talk about them, or I'll take their arguments and address those without engaging with them directly. If I take the time to interact with someone and have a conversation, it's because I respect them and care about them as a human being. It's because I think that they are reasonable and capable of changing their mind, that I'm not actually wasting my time, that something good may eventually come from this. I don't have a delusion that I'm going to change their mind over the course of a single conversation. But if I didn't value my relationship with that person, I wouldn't spend time one-on-one or in a small group trying to actually convince them, trying to actually show them where they're wrong. And this is something that they will understand, and you can help them understand it by pointing out that they're arguing with you, hopefully, because perhaps they care about your eternal soul, or they care about some action that you take, or they care about the fact that what you believe impacts what you do, and you may be taking a risk, and you may be making mistakes that are dangerous, and they care enough to try to stop you. That is your motivation for doing this, right? I mean, you can have whatever motivation you want, but my goal is to change the world. My goal is to help people, because people are what matter. And it's not enough just to sit around and be kind of glibly, snidely correct. Take the debate that I did with Cy. I don't like Cy. I wouldn't ever work with him again. It's not. It's because of things that he did in the debate and outside the debate that, we're just not going to connect. I don't see that it's likely that he's going to change his mind. I still respect him as a human being in the sense that I respect all human beings, but he's not like, my aunt or my father or my mother or somebody who I want to actually engage with. And he's not somebody who I think that it's likely that I'm going to change their mind. So in any conversation that I might have with them in the future, he's going to need to have an audience, because that's why I'm doing it, to reach people. And if somebody's unreachable, then they're just going to be the example that I use to reach other people. But the ultimate goal is to show that the arguments that we've been having for thousands of years, the mere fact that we continue to have these discussions demonstrates that there hasn't been any resolution, that there is no knockdown, drag out, silver bullet argument for or against religion, even though we think there are good ones. People become convinced for different reasons, and they're going to change their mind and give up those beliefs for different reasons. You can spend time looking for the magic argument, but I think if there's any strong argument, it's going to have to come from a place of compassion, a place of trying to change the world, a place of letting people know that the reason we're having these conversations is because we are all here on this planet sharing space. Our actions have consequences for ourselves and others. We would love to live in a world where everyone was rational. We would love to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible, and encourage that same thing in others. The motivations that you have for engaging in these conversations shine through. The audience is not stupid. Other people are not stupid. Just because they may be believing things without good reasons doesn't mean that the entirety of their character is stupid. We are compassionate, engaged, social creatures that have to interact. And if that comes through, if that's your motivation and it comes through to the audience, you are far more likely to be convincing than you are if you stand up and just dryly read something, or if you stand up and just regurgitate facts, or if you stand up and imitate something that you've seen somebody else to do, even if they were passionate about it, even if they were demonstrating compassion, because you don't feel it. We're human. There's an aspect of humanity to all of this, and that's what we're trying to save.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.